Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of Voices for Excellence. I am your host, Dr. Michael Connor, CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group, and as you already know, the host for VFE. And today's episode is the first episode in our September Welcome Back to School Leadership Series. And of course, I had to bring him on the show. I did not have to look far. Yes, Connecticut is still home for me. Living in New York now, obviously, but Connecticut will always be home. I have admired this individual ever since he stepped foot in the University of Connecticut Executive Leadership Program. And that is where we met. We shared a lot in common. I don't know why he was picking my brain, but ultimately, this brother is doing his thing in Stratford public schools. Really admire the work. One of the smartest, and this is, I don't say this much, but one of the smartest individuals that I know, and I had him bring him on to the podcast. So I would like to welcome the proud superintendent of Stratford Public Schools, Dr. Uyi Osunde. Dr. Osunde, wow, you made VFV. How you doing?
I'm great. I'm phenomenal. You're hyping me up here, and I appreciate that. But more so, over the last handful of years, you and I have built a relationship, and I learned a lot watching you lead, right, as the superintendent and transform outcomes for your children. So I appreciate it. I'm excited to be on the podcast. I've seen the roster of folks you've had on here, and you've had some titans in the industry. So it's just an honor to be part of the conversation and a thought leader around this work. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Dr. Osunde, I consider you one of the titans. I'll tell you that, the vitality, the strength, the veracity in the context of your transformation practices, as well as your methodologies that you underscored, is second to none. But hey, I can speak about it, but I want my audience to actually experience it and feel it with you. So we're going to go right into the podcast, Dr. Osunde. And I like to start out with a fun question, right? And I'm very interested to hear what song that is going to describe you. But we know that in Connecticut, when leaders follow your work, stakeholders from your district unwrap and hear you tell story points with regard to your vision, and education executives throughout the country, when they unwrap your vision, the vision of Dr. Osunde, what equity song defines your work? And how would you describe the leadership signature, or your leadership signature, with regards to systems work in the context of your district with equity in mind?
That's a pretty powerful question. I've listened to a few of your guests in previous podcasts, so I expected this question. As I was reflecting on the question, which song would represent my leadership work around equity, I did struggle with this a little bit, but I have to take it way back in the time to use some words. But I think the song that would best characterize my equity work is likely Marvin Gaye, right? What's going on? And he speaks about challenges, but one of the things he repeats on and on is that we have to find a way, right? And equity work is unending. It's work of the heart. And I could tell you this, before I got into administration, I was a school counselor for quite some time, and in those conversations at community here in Connecticut, a little bit north of where I'm at right now. And when I was a school counselor, I would sit in offices, with families. And in one meeting, I would have a very affluent, white family. And, 45 minutes after that, I would have a family that's really struggling paycheck to paycheck with some of the most brightest and most capable kids. So for me, from an equity standpoint, it became my life's work to make sure that we create opportunities and create some level of parity for kids to be able to have the quality of life that I feel all children deserve. So in that way, I would say that finding a way, working with folks and making sure that all kids are at the center of the conversation, I would say that Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, accurately captures my leadership disposition around equity work. Um, and again, just to build off of that, I think it's equity work it can't be solo work. Okay, it can't be solo work. It requires a consensus group of people who believe in the impact and the value of the work and how it stands to benefit all children, not just children who are disenfranchised. So I would say that what I do well across the school systems I've been blessed to work with is I get like-minded folks together to have a conversation and work in the direction for children. And I've been blessed and fortunate that we've generated some pretty good results.
Absolutely. And when we talk about Marvin Gaye, what's going on, that is a all-time classic, Dr.
Classic.
Uyi. It's a classic. It is with a capital C, not a lowercase c.
That's the man right there.
Absolutely. But when we unwrap it, right, specifically when we look at it in this analogous form of education finding a way, right? In equity, we know that when we look at equity work and being equity-driven leaders, finding a way is that constant iterative nature, iterative mindset that even though that one approach might work, what are the alternatives that we can be able to apply to ensure you use that word very intentionally, parity, right? Parity, equity, making sure that students get everything that they need based off of their fundamental needs. And when we talk about consensus, and this is where you're going to hear this throughout the podcast and me kind of reiterating it, right? Is that how do we reach that level of consensus with regards to the equity work that we're doing? But truly, when we think about equity and consensus, what's really going on in the education vector as we continue to unwrap it? But let's go back to you and I, personal, all right? And I remember a plethora of discussions we had, past and current, unwrapping various problems of practice within the education ecosystem. Moreover, right, our discussions have been focused lately on reaching consensus with equity, but deconstructing the operating model in education, specifically around the elements, right? The elements within this new demand of our economy. I like to equate it to Delta 2030. An example, when we talk about this, unwrapping it, equity and innovation and equity working in a synonymous context, is how we would integrate technology and AI, right? AI solutions and platforms in this phased step function context. But let's pretend you and I are on the phone. we talk a whole lot on the phone. Yes, to my audience, the 10 o'clock phone calls after board meetings. Dr. Osunde and I, we be having conversations, right? Or here's the better one. Dr. Osunde, when you're stuck in traffic at 6:30, you call me up, right? Stop calling me during traffic, right? That's like, who can I call? Let me call Mike. But what are some now? Let's pretend that we are on, a telephone call after a board meeting or when you're going home to your family. So what are some practical steps, right? And broad theoretical ideologies that leaders can implement and reference in this phase context to achieve a new operating or business model for Generation Alpha and Generation Z in the AC stage of education?
Well, there's a lot packed into that question there, but before I respond to that question, I just want to say, being stuck on 95 and I-95 in traffic is really one of the only solitary times I have to be able to get caught up on a few things. And since you're Mr. Worldwide right now, right, it's hard to get in touch with you. You don't be answering my calls no more. We'll start calling you Carmen Sandiego or Pitbull. But so impressed with what you're doing across the country and work that's happening now, it seems globally. But to answer your question, Michael, I think we can all agree that the current operating model is dated and it hasn't worked. It's worked for some, but it certainly has not worked for all. I think we can all agree to that from a consensus standpoint. But what is also debatably a little bit more problematic is that education has historically been a slow change and slow adapting sector of the work. I think despite the fact that we fail to keep, as a field, as a sector, we fail to keep pace with the change and rapid changes of things that are happening in society. I think Perhaps maybe more so than theoretical ideologies. I think what I think that all school system leaders, all leaders in general, have to do is number one is embrace that AI is here, right?
Mhm.
And it's likely here to stay. And there's a lot of work. It's AI is still um, in its infancy stage. There's a lot of things that have to be studied and from a design concept standpoint. But I think very similar to the late '90s and early 2000s, in the tech boom, it's going to be unavoidable, right? And we do anticipate that AI will continue to evolve. But I think first and foremost, what we have to do as leaders is understand the risk, right? Um, but I think, there's a saying that says that those who don't adapt, and I'll let the audience, the remaining part of that sentence. I think what is probably um, creating a level of enigma around AI right now is perhaps not necessarily what it can do for families, right? From a family engagement standpoint, you think about the various stakeholder groups, what it can do for educators and operating processes for school systems. But I think the deeper conversation is its impact on kids from an academic integrity standpoint. So there's more work to be done in investigating the ethics of AI. But when we talk about creating some level of parity and access, right, there is no doubt that this can benefit families, particularly families that have been historically marginalized. As superintendents, we are oftentimes, whether it's at workshops, conferences, or oftentimes in conversations with ed tech providers, right? And ed tech providers are at an alarming pace. I shouldn't even say alarming. I would probably characterize that at an impressive pace, are integrating AI into their solutions that they look to support school systems with. So, first and foremost, I think all school leaders need to embrace it. They need to study it. They need to understand the assets of how it can benefit what they're trying to accomplish. Um, and I think there's more work. Again, this naturally is at the forefront of the thinking of most teachers and educators. Is how do we safeguard against academic integrity aspects of this, and how do we make sure that kids continue to generate and produce authentic work?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love what you stated, Dr. Sunday, with regards to leaders, organizations, um, even to the level of classroom practitioners. We have to find a way to embrace, right, artificial intelligence, because right now, they're actually in the process and continuously as there are better data sets that are being developed, algorithms are becoming much more sophisticated.
Absolutely.
The amount of data that's being collected, but I always like to reference an MIT professor. He always stated that we have to be able to mine the gap, right? Mining the gap with machines and with humans, and finding that level of reciprocity where the resonating point is strategic integration interface to accelerate the business outcomes, to accelerate the vision, or more importantly, to accelerate the access and opportunity for the customer. And when I think about being customer centric and the education ecosystem as our families and our students, but this is going to be an ongoing conversation because again, you said it at the outset, education is a slow adaptive process, right? And I think that we have to accelerate that speed a little bit more if we want to ensure that our educational subsystems and even our structures are in alignment to the broader demand in the economy where, you're right, Dr. Sunday, we talked about this a while ago, and I'm going to bring this in. It's the fact that we can't have students operationalizing themselves in the real world, underscoring AI, developing algorithms, developing code, but then go into an academic environment where the teacher is heavy laden with direct instruction, where it's monolithic and regurgitation of information. We know the characteristics of Generation Z and Generation Alpha. They prefer relevance over compliance. And yes, everybody, this is how our conversations are at 10 o'clock at night.
Don't
So
tell people we're nerds. Don't tell people we're nerds. This is what we geek out to. And some people
geek out,
later,
geek out. So yes, this is what we
I'll
talk
take
about.
things that, you know,
Yeah,
it's enjoyable to talk with like-minded folks around, the evolution of not just where education is going, but what's important for kids. And for me, I think you're one of the deepest thinkers around the world. Really transformative for our our generation of educational leaders. So I follow your work. I've been following your work for years, and I see the different ways you're bringing this work to life across the country. But to your point, focusing on this generation of kiddos, right?
yeah,
I.e., things have to be meaningful and relevant for them, more so than this industrial model that's been, pervasive for the last 100 years, where it's largely anchored on compliance. We know that the demographic and cultural shifts of the country is transforming, really the world transforming, and it will be transforming rapidly over the next 25 to 35 years. So I think it's imperative that as leaders, not just political leaders, school system leaders, we pay attention to this and we keep pace and respond to the needs of our current and future learners.
absolutely. And this segues nice, Dr. Sunday, into our next question because, I know you work from a personal lens, a deep personal lens. I've seen your trajectory, even going into the superintendent role, and absolutely just admire everything about you, what you stand for, what you're doing for kids. You epitomize intentionality, boldness, and being unapologetic, right? And what I mean by that is how you're able to leverage your knowledge and your expertise to create systems of excellence and equity for all. Specifically, what you're doing now for Stratford Public Schools, just absolutely amazing. Congratulations on the outcomes, statistical outcomes, right? That we've seen within Stratford. I want you to highlight that for a little bit, but I want to get into this question because now that we're on the topic of Generation Z and Generation Alpha, right?
Yeah.
Just to give you context of where we're at. Right now, the generation of the millennials, right? Uh, Worldwide, they possess 35% of the jobs in the field today, not linear to one, but just a multitude of variety of different industries. Moreover, the predictive modeling or predictive analytics is grounding that by 2030, right? 2030, that's less than 7 years away.
Mm.
Uh, percent of the workforce, 50% of the workforce, both domestically and internationally, is going to be grounded with millennials as well as Generation Z. Okay. So now when we talk about the key attributes and characteristics of Generation Z, they were the first group for digital natives, right? They focus on collaboration. They're highly focused on relevance in lieu of compliance, right? So, and they're in our schools today. If you think about the public education vector, is dominated by Generation Alpha and Generation Z. Generation Alpha are our fifth grade students and below. Have an even, the differentiation of characteristics between Generation Z and Generation Alpha are even fundamental. I mean, it's fundamentally, there's a huge gap between that, right? And these are our generational students that we're educating, albeit we still operationalize on the Jeffersonian model, this bashed industrialization that has not changed, which you talked about. W.E. Deming, right? Or Deming, I apologize, has a great quote. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. This is where we see this gap, this exacerbation with regards to the students that we're educating and the design of the model. First, in your words, right? How are these students different that you see as a superintendent in Stratford Public Schools, Generation Z and Generation Alpha? And then also, too, you do a phenomenal job of this, an exceptional job. How do you empower the voice, i.e. agency, of your students in your district?
So it's a complex question, but it's really not that complex. It's actually straightforward. Um, you know, I would say, how would I characterize our kiddos, Generation Z and Generation Alpha? Um, I would say it's a group of kiddos. It's a generation of kiddos who know nothing other than the technology age and the social justice age.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is exclusively what they grew up in, right? So I think, our kiddos either know how to become creative, leveraging technology, or they know how to promote their voice. Okay, you've seen it, whether it's on the heels of the George Floyd murder or Parkland, or all the different things that have really happened over the last 12 to 15 to 17, maybe even 20 years. This is all they know growing up. I remember growing up, having one phone in the house and everybody at the line, all this, that was our technology, right? And I had no keyboard. You had 5 channels. One of them were scrambled, and that was my technology. I remember paid phones and all those different things. And
Paid phones when it cost a dime, Dr. Sunday.
bro, it's quarters, all that stuff, right? And so, our generation of kiddos, this is their basis. This is the mental schema of the world, is technology age and the social justice age, which, if you really kind of think about it, it's a powerful combination. It's a transformative combination, right? Give me the back half of that question as well, right? I know you were talking about agency, and so how do leaders create or enhance agency? I think simply by just creating a space for them to talk. Okay, certainly communicating to them that their voice is an important part in this matrix and algorithm that we call the education system. You'd be surprised how insightful that they are. When I was a principal, my students would sit down with me and they would make pitches. Okay, and I would walk them almost similar to a dissertation defense. Tell me why you want to do this, justify, and be sure to articulate the impact on the school or population of kiddos you're trying to impact. And if you've been through a doctoral program, sharing just one short set of slides, get your point across, so on and so forth. So what was happening now is I was having a flurry of kids who will show up with 35 slides. I'm like, listen, you got 18 minutes. I condense it. And what was happening now is our teachers, whenever they were trying to move something across the school, they would always tell the kids, okay, you go talk to Dr. Osunde about this, but you better come with your presentation. You better be sharp and better be well prepared. I think that's such an important aspect of the work. It's creating the space where they can do that, right? And for us here at Stratford, one of the things we've tried to do is weave our student voice into everything that we do. Okay. I mean, oftentimes, in the space of, the board governance structure or the superintendent's office, or these institutional beacons that represent the institution, there's some level of apprehension in some context. But we've knocked those barriers down, right? We're saying to folks, we're saying to kids, we're saying to families, we're saying to teachers that your voice matters. Okay. And to be honest with you, in all the conventions of how we're trained from a clinical and technical standpoint about how to design and how to operate and how to lead schools, our kids and our families, without those conventional training experiences, come with strategies that meet the same end, right? And it's a powerful process. When you're not able to marry that with outcomes and results, it builds internal confidence around the power of voice and power of agency. So now when we start to talk about results, it's not, oh, the superintendent and his leadership team did this, or it's not the principal and his leadership team did this. There's strategies that yielded these outcomes for kids, particularly kids of color, was a strategy that was proposed by a 14-and-a-half-year-old. Right? That is powerful from an agency standpoint, right? But beyond that, when you talk about, you think about the larger ecosystem of the work and the future aspirations and direction of the district or school system, parent voice, right? Parent voice is critically important in identifying those priorities. And if the outcomes are favorable or positive, you can say that this is not something that was constructed by the superintendent and his team. The superintendent perhaps operationalized it, but the strategy or the priority came out of your voice, and your voice matters. So we just have to create the space. And I think for things that make sense, we weave it into our systems design. And for us here, that's been something that every stop that I've ever been at is weaving voice into systems design in a way that I feel confident that my team and myself can operationalize and yield positive outcomes.
Absolutely. And Dr. Sunday, I wanted to tell you this and tell my audience this, and I've told you this plenty of times, Uyi, that you are one of the organizational assistant designs czar, right? And I've had
I'm
many,
here yet.
listen, I've had many
Appreciate
conversations
it.
with a lot of people, but for you to go into the, I like to say, complications and complexities, that level of polarity of and with the system and understanding key apparatus and tenets around the complexities and how to unwrap them is absolutely sensational. That's why I love our conversation, love our friendship, love our brotherhood. But I can tell you this, Dr. Sunday, going into your office and you creating it as a dissertation environment for a 17 and 18-year-old is scary. I don't know if I could at 17 go in there, know it's going to be a dissertation defense environment, get to the point. You're not Michael Connor who likes to exaggerate points and all of that, 18 minutes, and that's it. Okay, I'm scared.
So the thing that was compelling and powerful about it is that it became culture, you know,
Yes.
and our staff actually started to replicate some of the same things, and I would adopt it, So I would always the kids would come and I would ask questions, probing questions to either expand thinking or expand thoughts or challenge design and construct. Um, but I would always say to the kids, if you make a pitch and we have the resources to do it, there's no reason why I should not do it, right?
Absolutely.
So, in the same process is the same with same process was the same with our teachers, and even here right now, when whether there's a cabinet member or a member of a professional community here, they come with a cogent and concise pitch justification, knowing that Dr. Sun is going to ask questions, and again, my philosophy remains the same. Um, in that if we have the resources to do it, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do it.
Absolutely. I always, used to state, when I was a superintendent, that it's going to be very hard for me to say no to a student, right? And one thing that I love about hearing this is that the voices of the students, the agency, the empowerment is always there because, yes, I'm going to have to use research language for this, Dr. Sunday. You take an ethnographic approach and have a level of empathy to understand your families and students to be able to design in accordance to the confluence of what they want and what they need to meet their needs with that. But I love the phrase, create the space to talk. And I think that we need more opportunities with that. I don't know if you heard about this, but there has been some proposed legislation to increase the voter age to 25. And I think, and this is just, again, a theory that I'm developing, is because it goes back to exactly what you stated with regards to that meta theme of students being technology savvy, but more importantly, the social justice lens. We're seeing a lot of that because
Yep.
the Generation Z really focuses on diversity, right, and diverse perspectives. But what we see for Generation Alpha is this global mindset, right?
Sure.
We see that that's where the elements of equity and social justice comes in. So the only theory that I have is to shut their voices out, to raise the voter age to 25.
It's institutional design intended to oppress. Let's call it what it is. A
Absolutely.
grumbling and powerful voice, right? And that's I wasn't aware of that, but that's just terrible to hear. That's an educational leader, somebody who works with kids and families. That's just terrible to hear.
Yeah, that was proposed. So I don't think it's going to move through because obviously we have Generation Z and Generation Alpha who will speak up about that. But continuing on, right, we know that speaking of Generation Alpha, Generation Z, right, the educational needs have radically shifted, right? And it was highlighted more in the pandemic and even during the pandemic. Equity hit everybody. Inequities hit everyone. Didn't matter where you fall on the demographic level, on the sociographic level, even at the psychographic level, right? Inequities and disparities did hit all families to some context. But in your words, I want you to describe what equity-driven work looks like in the context of where the actions or these actions, right, are going to be in alignment to the paradigm shifts of the AC stage of education. That's the first question, right? And then the second question is, now that we know the educational needs, right, of our students, now that we have unwrapped and unpacked what equity-driven work looks like. I want you, in your own words, to define urgency as it relates to being intentional and bold to achieve the results that we want for all.
Again, I'm not surprised, Mike. You got layers to your questions, right? It's like, wait, what? So, equity work. Yeah, I think the work begins with just number one, being very committed to naming it, calling it out. Okay, naming the conditions and the disparities that exist and how it's impacting folks, right? Specifically, and again, you can break that down to layers: kids, staff, families, so on and so forth. The thing about equity challenges is that oftentimes it's not a burden that's solely owned by the school system. It's oftentimes a societal characteristic as well that obviously permeates and emerges in the school system because by law, um, all kids are expected to attend school. Um, I think, defining equity work and the urgency of the work is number one, anchoring it on what we can visibly see. Two, anchoring it on the voices and experiences of folks. And then two, the data, right? So to your point, the pandemic, I wouldn't even say that illuminated something that we knew was already there. It did. It's been there. It's been there for almost a century, right? Um, but for us here in Stratford, one of the things that we've been very deliberate about is defining how we perceive equity. Okay, for a common language, right? And so for us, we define equity around three core constructs. One, access. Okay. So with that, you think about resources, you think about biases and all those different things that may serve as impediments for kids to have opportunities, all kids to have opportunities. And naturally, we're a school system. So we obviously take a look at performance, right? Performance, right? And then the last piece is experience, right? So those are three of the constructs that kind of drive our equity work.
It's on Sunday. And I apologize for interjecting because, my audience use this as an asynchronous professional learning tool so that they can be able to go back and forth with regards to listening to these strategies, listening to these practices, applying it, going back. It's that design thinking process of ideation and iteration at the same time. Can you, for my audience again, because those three constructs are very important, can you repeat them one more time?
Sure. The three approaches we have to make sure we create some level of to combat or respond to the equity disparity conditions are focused on access, right? And because we're an academic institution, performance, obviously, performance and achievement, and then experience, right? So when we talk about experience, and that's a critical aspect of the work. In my school system, we have about 72% of my children are kids of color, right? Conversely, the professional staff, we've done a lot of work, but professional staff looks very similar to the national data where it's an integrated model, so to speak. We've done a lot of work in that area, but we're very intentional that if we have determined that those are the core ways, the core constructs we're going to respond to address the equity challenges and disparities we have here, right? Then we automatically jump into a design concept aligned with strategy is how we're going to respond to each of those three constructs: access, performance, and experience, right? Experience is probably the foundation of a lot of this work, right? Which becomes conversations about dignity and feeling value and a sense of belongingness, a sense of connectedness. And we use that layered with not just our children, right? But also with our staff and also with our family. Now, I don't want to make any kind of claim that we are at our arrival state. I'm starting my third year here and honored to be positioned to continue to lead this district. But we're doing some pretty impressive things, right? And oftentimes when it comes to the experience aspects of those three-pronged approach, creating voice and agency makes people feel valued, right? Makes people feel valued, right? And they feel like they belong, right? Because with voice, you can start to help shape a common identity, right? And it's a powerful concept. So, one of the things that you probably recognize is those three constructs that I just mentioned, by design, they're intended to be self-reinforcing, okay? So it's a powerful opportunity, but design and similar to you, I'm a complex thinker. I think you're in some Elon Musk type complex thinker. I'm still down here, but
Okay, Bill Gates.
yes, actually go against account. Um, but I believe deeply in form for function. So when you design strategy and you employ those design principles, um, you design it, to go back to your phrase from W.E. Deming. A system is designed to do what it's supposed to do. And if we are intentional and deliberate about thinking deeply about what we want to happen for our children and our school communities, then we can design towards that direction. And for us right now, with a rapidly transforming racial demographic and a rapidly transforming economic demographic, our equity work, unapologetically, right, has been centered around those three things. It was also important that we put in the structure and processes and human capital to make sure that that work came to life. I've been blessed that I've received my board support around the work. We don't beat on our chest about it. We do the work because it benefits children. But I also have a team of folks who are passionate about equity work, who are championing it, my school leaders, right? So equity work can be implemented to the extent that the disposition of the people leading the school even in as well. And again, here at Stratford, we're blessed that our school leaders have leaned into the work.
Absolutely. And I can tell you this, Dr. Sunday, Stratford's blessed to have you. And, I don't say much, with regards to a lot of systems in Connecticut that educate my son, but I would actually have no problems putting Mikey in your school system because I know that he will excel under your leadership with that. But more importantly, when you talked about creating that common identity, I always go back to Edgar Schein's work. And I think one of the hardest things that we as organizational leaders, as executives and superintendents, is not the hardware, right? Not the hardware shifts, the hardware of the structures and systems in education is creating exactly what you just stated, the common language around the three constructs that you identified with access, performance, and experience, that shared mental model, right? How do we create that shared mental model and break some of the old mind habits or mind frames to be able to create new mind frames? I always say that within an organization, if we're going to get to this utopia of creating a shared model, a common mental model around the three constructs that you identify with access, performance, and experience, you have to learn, to unlearn, to relearn. Shifting the software within an organization. And I can tell you right now, the three constructs that you identified around a common language and building those systems of practice is absolutely phenomenal. You have that intentionality around the software when you know the hardware is going to get you the performance outcomes that you need. It very systematic, very systematized, Dr. Osunde. But let me get into this question. This is a variant that's out there, right? And I wanted to touch upon this with you because I know that, your work, your direct involvement with the University of Connecticut is immense, right? Is deep. Your voice is there. And specifically how you are engaging with officials, higher education officials, and board of trustee members at the higher education level. So I definitely wanted to unwrap this. I most recently, it was just released in August, a blog piece for Tom Vander Ark, right? One of his fellows for Getting Smart. And I wrote about how students could potentially feel invisible with the affirmative action decision that was just lamented by the Supreme Court, right? So the recent decision by the Supreme Court reversed affirmative action as it pertains to higher education admission processes, right? There are a bastion of theories highlighting negative negative, not positive, negative future implications in the context of discriminatory acts that will impact Black and Brown students for successfully matriculating into higher educations. I'm speaking specifically, Dr. Sunday, with the PWIs, right? Predominantly white institutions. Now,
Okay.
I want to take it to another step, right? There's theories out there where there's going to be negative implications in the context of elite PWIs, both large and small Ivies, where we would even see this immense phenomenon where a silo, where the context is going to be PWIs and HBCHU, historically Black and college universities, right? But I want to know, what are your perspectives and views about this decision? I wrote about it, but I've been talking to a lot of people with regards to this decision and how we can be able to address this to ensure that discriminatory acts does not take place in higher education admission processes. And also, too, what advice, since you have the ear of Board of Trustee members, since you are revered at the university level, right? What type of advice can you offer these officials to ensure Black and Brown students do not become invisible in predominantly white institutions?
Again, this is Elon Musk question number 72. My brother, you keep it coming.
I love it, brother. You know that.
There's a level of brilliance to the way you frame questions, but I think my response to this question is, I think similar to most people, I think we can all say that we're deeply disappointed in the decision by the courts. Okay, and you know, dating back to the repeal of Roe v. Wade, right, and then now affirmative action. You go back to our earlier conversation about a system usually does what it's designed to do. I mean, this actually, if you really kind of think about it, this really what this amounts to is an institutional discrimination that's propagated by the justice system, right? And it only naturally leads to more marginalization. So there's disappointment across the board. When I think about PWIs and I think about higher education, there's some level of dissonance for me in the context of this affirmative action case because, as I shared with you before I got into the world of administration and school systems leadership, I was a school counselor. And for so long, we told children that, go to college, get a degree, right? Build your skills and capacities, network, you become a lot more marketable. And it goes back to that conversation I started this segment with, where I said I wanted my kids to have a better quality of life and not live paycheck to paycheck. So on so many different levels, this is disappointing. It's not to say that college is the sole pathway for children. I mean, there are kids who, and we're going to create, we're creating those things here in the school system, opportunities for kids to still maximize and tap into their life's passion and maximize as contributing members to the demands of the new economy, so to speak. But when we think about PWIs, I think the advice I would give Board of Trustees is to be very intentional, okay, about seeking out and writing policies that actively combat marginalization of scholars, scholar candidates of color, okay? That would be the number one. But more importantly, I think there needs to be added focus on the gatekeepers of students' entry points to institutions, PWIs, even Ivies, and that's the admissions office on every campus, okay? That's the admissions office on every campus. So there's work to be done there. I think, I would argue that if you sit down and you talk to, and it's not grounded in any kind of fact or data, it's just a personal assumption, right? Perhaps not a disposition, but an assumption. But if you sit down with the administration at most institutions, with perhaps not strong and formidable conservative perspectives, and the Board of Trustees, I would assume that they would disagree with the decision of the courts. But I think there has to be deliberate work that supports that disagreement, right? It has to play out that way in how they conduct themselves and how they bring this work to life. I do think that for us, for school systems leaders who have been working incredibly hard to make sure that kids build the capacity, grow and develop as academic scholars under our watch, it creates some level of dissonance now for us to talk about access, right?
Oh, right.
Talk about access, right? And experience, right? And performance, right? And we do all this work at the K-12 level, right? To build the life force that exists within our children. And then they get to the gates of the institution of higher learning and they're getting stiff-armed. That is a complete, right, contradicting mission in terms of what we're trying to accomplish for our children. We want our kids that should they choose to go to school, okay, and there's far more PWIs than there are HBCUs in this country. Should they choose to go to school and they have worked, they've put in the time, the effort, the energy, and they are outstanding scholars, the core system should not have the authority to create this proverbial stiff arm, right? When we know that there are biases out there for admissions and all those different variables that really kind of adversely impacts the child's candidacy, that's problematic. So I think there has to be broader conversations between higher education institutions and K-12 to make sure our admissions are aligned and we can support them around how to, you know, write policies and work with the admissions office in a way that what this justice system, whether it's, you know, deliberate or not deliberate, what they are slated to do by design does not continue to marginalize a group of people who have been historically disenfranchised.
Absolutely. And well stated, Dr. Sunday, because essentially the Supreme Court is explicitly and implicitly stating that PWIs, higher education, academic institutions need to become colorblind, right? And the reality is the world that you and I live in, I don't know where colorblindness is, right? And they might articulate it in this verbal context, but when it comes to what you and I feel is something that is fundamentally different. A common mentor of ours, Dr. Stephen Adamowski, would say it is the antithesis of what we believe. Shout out to Dr. A. Love you.
Shout out to Dr. A. Listen, we want to talk about a deep thinker just sitting down with that man for lunch for hours. It's just, I mean, you walk away almost every time. I won't say almost, certainly every time, just being smarter yourself. So, yeah, Doc's great.
Listen, Dr. Adamowski, I'll tell you, when I worked under him as his chief academic officer, everybody would say, how was it working under Dr. A? I said, listen, it was PD every day and I got paid for it.
I was going to say, I talk to him from time to time and we have lunch from time to time, but you were 7 to 7 with.
Listen, I love every bit of it. That's how I am right now in systems thinker. But you are absolutely right, Dr. Sunday, when it comes to policy development, articulation of the policy implementation, but also really focusing on the admissions office, right? And focusing on what is the propensity and density in the context of the percentage of students, how we're looking at students from the entry points and matriculation, successfully matriculating into some of these elite or regular institutions. But you stated a phrase that means a lot: deliberate work, right? We have to be deliberate and we have to be intentional in this alignment. And I think that, with leaders such as yourself and leaders across the country who are looking or screaming for that K-12 higher education alignment, right? That's where now we're seeing this disjunction where there is rooted and grounded work specifically within this level of equity and excellence to ensure that all means all, breaking down or dismantling these historical constructs for new constructs. But again, another barrier that we have to successfully hurdle over is specifically this outcome from the Supreme Court. But as I stated in my blog and how I ended it, we shall overcome. So the last question,
You got to
Doctor.
find a way, Marvin Gaye. Got to find a way.
Oh, coherence right there, big brother. But the you killing me on this, man. I love you, bro. But the last question, right? And this is just for my audience sake, right? And the 3 words that they want to take out of this. But what 3 words do you want today's audience to leave our episode to address the volatility and the complexities of all in the AC stage of education? And those 3 words, right? What should my audience do to always ground their mindset when these new demands are ambiguous in nature and ambiguous in context?
So after the AC stage, the AC stage was, government stage was challenged across the board, and the outcome of the AC stage is just a greater need that we have to be responsive to. So I'm assuming that most of your audience are systems leader in some level of the org structure. So I would say resiliency, right? Which is now, resiliency precedes perhaps my next word, which would be commitment to the work. Okay, so not every day is going to be gumdrops and sunshine, right? And then ingenuity. Okay, we have to have an out-of-the-box thinking approach to respond to the needs of what we've seen emerge out of the pandemic. So this AC stage of education will require a great deal of ingenuity from school system leaders, really not just relegated to the education sector, any leadership entity as a whole. So resiliency, commitment to the work. I think this is important work. Again, Marvin Gaye, you have to find a way. So you have to stay committed to it, even if the answers are not as obvious. And then ingenuity.
Absolutely. And those 3 words, right, when I think about them, absolutely needed in the AC stage of education: resiliency, commitment, and ingenuity. But bringing it back to Marvin Gaye, finding that way. Dr. Osunde, so now there's no more questions, right? But here's the thing. We lasted, right? You lasted, I should say, this episode of Voices for Excellence. Moreover, what I'm happy about is not at 10 o'clock at night after a board meeting, and I'm not your I-95 call.
I'll take this, but I always enjoy talking shop with you. And like I said, it's, the superintendent is typically a singular role, so whenever you get a chance to talk to people who've done the work and found success in the work and continue to push the thresholds of the limitations of the field to advance things for children, it's always refreshing. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. And Dr. Osunde, I know because this is our Welcome Back series that we're having on Voices for Excellence, leaders across the country, they reach out to each other. I try to create the network effect in the context of being able to share practices and ideas. Anybody in my audience that want to be able to go deeper with this, how would they be able to get in contact with you?
Sure. I'm active on LinkedIn. Just look up my name. I'm also active on Twitter at Supt, Suptosunde, Supt Osunde on Twitter, or I guess it's called X now, right? Your boy Elon, you get things over there. But you can also reach me by simply calling the email me at the district office.
Absolutely. And Uyi, thank you so much for being on Voices for Excellence. I am sure, big brother, I will talk to you probably in 2 days, next week, about something. I'm truly, truly appreciative that you even reach out to me just to be able to bounce ideas back and forth. Humbled and honored, especially from someone who I just admire from an academic standpoint, an educational leader standpoint, and just as a brother. So you made it through. I appreciate you, man. Call me. We got to talk. We got to catch up. And for my audience, onward and upward, everybody. Have a great evening.